Many thanks to Stockholm's Kvinna Historiska Museum for inviting Kvinna till Kvinna to this collaboration. And thanks to the Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation for nominating me to participate as one of the staff in this collaboration. So I wanted to say, first of all, that I know it says on the webpage expert, but I must say I don't think I'm an expert. I'm more of a storyteller. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share some of my stories and some of Kvinna till Kvinna stories with you today. We are going to be looking at women's roles in war and conflict, and maybe more different concepts that come around that. I also wanted to say that in Kvinna till Kvinna, we talk about conflict-affected areas or conflict countries, but for the sake of this lecture, we're deciding to talk about conflict and war, just to say that for us in Kvinna till Kvinna, it still means conflict-affected countries. We prefer to use that because, unfortunately, even when war officially ends, when there is some peace agreement, conflict tends to remain, and there are many countries that have ongoing long-term conflicts. What I wanted to share with you today is first a little personal account of identifying why women's issues are important from the perspective of conflict and war. Then sharing some experiences of absence of women's voices in conflict and war, of Kvinna till Kvinna's experience in South Caucasus. Moving on to gendered differences of activism, what it means, the anti-gender movements and shrinking space for women's movements, and then about Kvinna till Kvinna and our mission in addressing the context in which women's movements and women's civil society organizations work today. So starting with the personal account, I was born in Yugoslavia, in Sarajevo. Today it is the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I wanted to share some kind of my awakening as a woman in situations of conflict and war. I had experienced different kinds of discrimination, like sexual harassment at the university, but in my times, because I'm in my mid-50s, unfortunately, that was almost a socially accepted occurrence, and despite my complaints, I could not do much about it. My first experience of war goes back to 1980. It was in Baghdad at the start of the Iraq-Iran war. Iranian MiG-21s were bombing Baghdad in late September that year. The experience was not really one revealing direct discrimination, but it is interesting in how it showed me that women and girls, in an attempt to kind of shield them from conflict by men and boys, are actually being denied information and being lied to. I woke up to the sound of bombing that morning. Unusually, my father was sitting at the bottom of my bed, and when he saw me wake up, he immediately got up and started waving towards the large window panes and saying, "Those are birds, those are just some big birds flying." I was only 13 at the time, but I could first see that he was very upset, and secondly, it was very clear that there is no way those big planes could have been mistaken for birds. We remained in Baghdad for a few weeks before we were evacuated to Yugoslavia. And one more experience also remains in my memory. We were a few families on the terrace roof of the house, and we were watching anti-aircraft missiles shoot through the night sky, looking like some very loud, endless fireworks. It almost seemed as if it was easier to bear the sound of conflict if you could see it. And one of my, peers, other kids on the roof, a boy came up to me and said, "Oh, look, this is so spectacular. You would surely wish to have such fireworks for your wedding," which was very strange to tell a young girl during a war experience. But my real understanding how women's voices are unheard, how their invisibility in history, in politics, in decisions taken that affect their lives, was when I was on my first visit to a refugee camp in Croatia in the early 1990s. I was accompanying a team of people visiting a refugee camp who were there to assess the level of and the quality of humanitarian aid that was reaching the camp and the conditions of living there. I was the only woman in the team. It was a very big camp, and when we entered it, suddenly a lot of women flocked towards me and kind of guided me away. They asked me whether I had any period pads, any tampons with me, or if I could get some for them or some underwear. And they explained that the humanitarian aid packages did include some basic hygienic products like shampoo, toothpaste, but never pads. And that when they got secondhand clothes, they never got underwear, and they were there for months. So experience and research shows that, and I'm quoting Gilliand here, displaced persons and refugees are often the forgotten casualties of war. The fact that worldwide the majority of refugees are women with their dependent children contributes to this neglect, end of quote. Life in a refugee camp itself has an effect of gender roles and relations. Old roles become difficult or impossible to fulfill. Refugees must adapt to new patterns of daily life, new relationships with family members, and they've also lost work that gave sense to their identity. And they are then living in condition where they are denied basic hygienic products, learning to live with the lack of everything. I learned later many other aspects of how gender affects refugee life that can have an impact on the safety of women and girls. For instance, gender-based violence can be considerably prevented in refugee camps if there is adequate planning of where bathrooms for women and girls are located, or other important service points for women and girls, and ensuring sufficient lighting throughout the camp, etc. Going on to the topic of absence, or kind of continuing on the topic of absence of women's voices in conflict and war. The following is dedicating to exploring some key concepts within the Nagorno-Karabakh example. So Kvinna till Kvinna has been active in the South Caucasus almost now 20 years, I think, definitely over 15. Women still lack the roles needed to effectively participate in peace negotiations in the region's conflicts. And specifically in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, women are almost entirely excluded from peace processes. Although termed a frozen conflict since the 1990s, many locals experience its effects as far from dormant. Kvinna till Kvinna published a report 5 years ago, 2019, Listen to Her, in order to amplify women's voices. And it was a result of engaging many women activists and those most affected by the conflict, hearing from women striving to survive and younger women hoping for a brighter future. All these Kvinna till Kvinna publications are available online, There are amazing colleagues and other experts that were editors and reference group and co-editors, but I will not be able to mention all names. So one of the things that was looked at was the effect of militarization on identity and agency. And militarization, which involves preparing and equipping a society for war, is deeply rooted in both Armenia and Azerbaijan's political and social scenes, significantly influencing personal identities and actions. We will be discussing here now how gender and militarization are connected, examining how notions of womanhood are shaped, identities are restricted to define the enemy, and the impact of militarism on individual agency. Gender norms and roles are crucial in nation building and militarization. Women and the concept of womanhood play significant roles in supporting and sustaining militarism. Although few women serve in combat positions and many support military efforts, motherhood stands out as a key way women contribute to militarization. Women connect to the military through their sons and other young male relatives who must complete mandatory military service. Women can be drawn into militarization through their relationships with men, particularly by being mothers and thus future soldiers, producers, providing services like cooking and cleaning for the military, or teaching patriotic values. As mothers, women contribute to militarization and nation building by giving birth to and raising male recruits, instilling patriotic values in their male children. One person highlighted in this report saying, the role of the woman is that she should raise her male child in such a way that the child serves the homeland. The fate of the homeland is in the hands of the mother. Thus, women's reproductive labor is central to militarization. Nonetheless, they're often excluded, or I wanted to say always, from decision-making in male-dominated militaristic nation, limiting their reproductive choices. Discussion around sexual and reproductive rights, militarization, power dynamic as an option for women not to have children was not mentioned by any of the participants in the research. Militarism in various contexts depends also on creating a distinct image of the other. The prevailing narrative suggests that the survival of the nation hinges on drawing clear lines between the nation and external threats, supported by military might and militaristic rhetoric. In the countries involved in this conflict, the April War served to boost patriotic fervor and harden negative views towards the opposing side. Women in several areas confirmed that attitudes towards the other have worsened since the escalations in mid-2010s. Across different communities, there existed a tension between the desire for peace and the pervasive distrust of the other side. And this is something we see in many other conflicts. The military is often seen as the cornerstone of social protection, yet this perception also heightens the risk of women losing loved ones. There are contradictions in how many women viewed motherhood and militarization. On one hand, many women believed that no mother should lose her son in a war, but they also, on the other hand, have had the feeling that it is their duty to prepare their sons for military service. One woman encapsulated this dilemma by pointing out that women endure the pain of childbirth only to be expected to raise their children as patriots, which for males conscripted to the military might mean sacrificing their lives for their homeland. I dream of a world without borders, she concluded. Several women also emphasized the role of media, including social media, in maintaining hostile attitudes. Many said they consume media from all areas in conflict. acknowledging the presence of propaganda and misinformation in both countries. Still, a recurring sentiment on both sides was the recognition that these media influence in perpetuating hostility towards each other. But also, many of them were saying their propaganda is worse than ours. So this fits with a narrative of tolerance, as women on both sides expressed the view, the perceived asymmetry and portrayal of the other that is being used to justify a belief that conflict cannot be solved through peaceful means, that militarization was the default option for most women. And the other view is that the construction of the other can also happen within the nation. So, for instance, for specific identities like unmarried women, LGBTQI plus persons, or those who have deserted military, they can be portrayed also as enemies of the nation. On militarism and agency, militarism influences women's sense of agency in various ways, instilling a sense of strength, but also fostering feelings of disempowerment. In the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, the April War revived displays of rhetoric and strength. Accounts from younger and older women, both rural and urban, described how men and boys were eager to fight without waiting to be drafted. A teacher recalled how adolescent boys from 9th to 11th grade eagerly expressed their desire to fight on front lines, waving flags and marching the streets. The patriotism among school children highlights how successfully militarism is integrated into the education system. In contrast, militarism also creates feelings of disempowerment. Many women expressed a sense of hopelessness and an inability to influence the conflict. They felt powerless to change the system, focusing instead on the struggle for everyday survival and social and economic security. Women argued that poor socioeconomic conditions lead to passivity, as people's energy and time are consumed by employment and survival. Cultural and gender norms also contribute to disempowerment, positioning men as the ones in charge and discouraging women from resistance and activism. Women are often too busy with child rearing to access information about their rights, let alone claim them. One woman mentioned instances of women protesting for their rights, such as pregnant women demonstrating for better maternity leave. However, in some contexts, restrictive political environments, rather than a lack of will or competence, prevent women from engaging in protests or visible activism. The gender disempowerment is also evident in how women view their role in peace building. Many felt unqualified to work in the political sphere, believing to be men more suited for those roles. The self-undermining reflects the patriarchal social context, but also sometimes the patriarchal views of some of the women. So it's also important to remember all the various burdens women assume, how they strive to make ends meet with scarce resources, and showcasing examples of collective coping strategies, looking at how women try to redefine their burdens as unseen forms of agency, finding strength in surviving in their challenging circumstances. The unseen agency is evident in their unpaid domestic work, their roles as the sole breadwinner, and the strategies they use to manage those burdens. For over a decade, the Kvinna Foundation has tracked the security situation for women human rights defenders worldwide. The 2023 report indicates a worrying rise in harassment and threats against women's and LGBTQI rights. Activists impacting 75% of the respondents of that report. Despite these challenges, hope and resistance remain intertwined for the women human rights defenders. The following I want to share with you are some of the findings from this most recent report called The State of Women Human Rights Defenders from 2023. Activists of all kinds encounter resistance around the world. In Kvinna till Kvinna, we argue, however, that women's and queer rights activists stand out for three reasons. The first is power. In many patriarchal contexts, simply speaking up as a woman or queer person is enough to become a target of hatred. And defending women's and LGBTQI+ rights not only reinforces the resistance of authoritarian regimes, religious or traditional leaders and populists, it only reinforces them. The second one is silence. Threats and harassment that are used to silence women's and queer rights activists are gendered. Activists are sexually harassed in the streets, assaulted in police custody as bad mothers and sluts, and told that their daughters will be raped. The third is space. Women and members of the LGBTQI+ community tend to be grossly underrepresented at all levels of formal decision-making. Their only space to call for change is civil society. When civic space closes, women's and queer rights activists lose the one platform they have to influence their societies. And this one space, the civil society space, is at great danger in recent years from anti-gender movements. The term anti-gender movement originated and gained traction through the efforts by the Vatican in the late 20th century as a reaction to the progress of women's rights and LGBTQI+ movements and the advent of gender studies in universities. Notable milestones like the UN Conference on Population and Development in Cairo in 1994 and the Beijing Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, when they replaced sex with gender in UN terminology and introduced the idea of sexual and reproductive rights for women, were perceived by Vatican and similar entities as shifts and as a significant ideological defeat, as they see biological sex as reflecting so-called natural order and view gender as a mere construct and ideology. The anti-gender narrative has been co-opted by conservative and religious groups, legislative bodies, and political fringe elements to challenge human rights, deny climate change, undermine academic research, and advocate for authoritarianism. This has resulted in unexpected coalitions among fundamentalist and Orthodox communities, Catholics, Islamists, right-wing secularists, nationalists, populists, and conservatives. These groups often leverage the anti-gender stance to gain or retain power. For anti-gender movements, the conflict is a cultural war of ideologies. Challenging traditional values can be a huge risk for women human rights defenders and their organizations. In North Macedonia, the screening of an anti-feminist and anti-trans film, What is a Woman, in a small town led to personal attacks against an activist. Her polite inquiry on Facebook about the movie sparked hostility. One day, while picking up her child from daycare, a mother confronted her about her so-called bad way of thinking. The harassment grew to an extent that she had to ask another family member pick up her child from daycare to avoid further confrontation. There is a surge of anti-gender. In this report, the results and interviews show a global network of anti-gender and anti-rights groups aligning with authoritarian movements, populists, far-right supporters, targeting women's and LGBTQI rights worldwide. Their collective efforts pose a serious threat to democracy and human rights. As an activist from sub-Saharan Africa observed a rise in anti-gender sentiment during the pandemic, noting that behaviors and statements that were previously socially unacceptable have now become more commonplace. And as a colleague of mine from North Macedonia says, we should not be talking about the increase of anti-gender movements, but we should be recognizing that now, unfortunately, they are anchored. They're here to stay. There is also, as the earlier example showed, the defamation and slander, global network of anti-gender and anti-rights groups. Activists in various regions report that these anti-gender actors and movements have become stronger, better connected with authorities, and wealthier during the pandemic, making it more dangerous for women's and LGBTQI+ rights activists. A Kenyan activist noted, somehow it became okay to say and do things that weren't socially acceptable just 4 years ago. People who used to hide their bigotry on social media are now doing these things openly under their own name, and it's scary. And talking of funding, anti-gender movements are often very well funded, while women's rights movements rarely are. So the ongoing surge in anti-gender movements sentiment creates an extra burden on already cash-strapped civil society and women's civil society organizations. While anti-gender movements like to clamor that gender ideology is a Western import and that women's rights organizations are spies financed by foreign countries, aka the evil West, much of their own funding also comes from the USA and countries like Europe, and Russia is another main source of funding. Tracing anti-gender funding is not easy, but AVID, the Association of Women in Development, has made attempts to do so. And in 2021, the organization found that anti-rights actors continued growing in their financial and political power. For instance, the budget of the anti-gender group Alliance Defending Freedom went from $14 million in 2002 to $60 million in 2019. The Spanish-based anti-gender organization Citizen Go has senior executives of companies like IBM and Nestle among its donors. Women human rights defenders are crucial actors for change in their societies. They challenge deeply the rooted patriarchal norms on a daily basis, simply by being professional, outspoken women, as well as through the nature of their work. For civil society to be effective in advocating for democracy and human rights, it has to be diverse and inclusive so that voices of marginalized groups can be heard. And the vision of, in this context, the vision of Kvinna is a world of peace and justice in which women have equal rights, power, and opportunities. It all started as an act of solidarity. In 1993, when reports of mass rapes during the wars in former Yugoslavia reached Sweden, the Swedish peace and women's movements made a joint appeal under the name Kvinna till Kvinna. They organized a series of fundraising initiatives to support women's rights organizations in the Balkans, triggering a massive response. And since then, Kvinna till Kvinna has grown considerably, supporting 150 local partner organizations in over 20 countries, supporting, conducting, and publishing research and raising public awareness in order to end violence against women, to reach lasting peace and close the gender gap. Kvinna operates in the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and the South Caucasus. And in supporting local women-led organizations without attaching importance to religious, political, national, or ethnic affiliation. Working towards stronger movements is perhaps more crucial than ever, and we have seen important efforts to overcome differences and foster unity. Safe spaces are a vital aspect of the work, providing a forum for activists to share experiences and strategies to shape a better future. There is a transformative impact of these spaces, not least for strengthening solidarity among activists. In the words of a Liberian women's rights activists, quoting, "The movement will be stronger when women realize that we need to help each other, no matter who we are and where we come from," end of quote. In a climate which actively creates a context where advancing the rights of women and girls is a difficult task, there is still time to hold the line, to stand firm and collectively defend women's rights. Networking is essential for this. Many activists experience the movement as their main source of strength and emphasize the importance of solidarity, both among activists from the international community. So flexible funding and increased support are vital. It is nothing less than a matter of democracy to ensure the voices of women's rights activists are heard. And I wanted to share with you a few examples of how Kvinna supported women's movements and women human rights defenders in the last year. In sub-Saharan Africa, in November last year, over 30 women human rights defenders from 10 conflict-affected countries gathered for a second annual meeting co-organized by Kvinna and the Life and Peace Institute in Nairobi. They shared updates on their progress of the past 12 months, highlighting their efforts to broaden the women's movement in their countries and make it more inclusive. They mentioned that they had worked hard to engage with those most marginalized to ensure their voices would be represented, including women with disabilities, women from the LGBTQI+ community, women in prostitution, women living with HIV/AIDS, women from religious minorities, and women from indigenous and/or ethnically marginalized communities. In Georgia, you have maybe been witnessing these days in the media a pushback against shrinking space. Georgia's civil society, led by women's groups, rights activists, and organizations, succeeded in pushing back once for the adoption of a proposed so-called foreign agents law. This law threatened to significantly restrict and monitor international actors, donors, and the work of local civil society organizations. There is still the threat of the law's adoption. I think this is what the events were these days. And also a similar law is being proposed in Bosnia, in Republika Srpska, and there were large demonstrations of civil society dedicated to that. Supporting protesting feminicide in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2023, Bosnia witnessed a surge in protests against rising femicide rates, and nationwide rallies were organized on October 11th, and they gained remarkable media attention, a reaction to the brutal murder of a woman in front of her baby, live streamed on social media. The case highlighted the failure of the justice system to protect women who report violence, considering that the victim was denied court protection just days before she was murdered. Advocating for women's rights in Syria, Kesh Malik, one of Kvinna's Syrian partner organizations, is dedicated to advancing women's economic rights, and its Kafwa project focuses on empowering Syrian women by providing them with the necessary skills and experience to access the job market and have a greater say in their society to achieve equal representation in the private and public structures. Gaza partners have now become humanitarian heroes. Since October 7th, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has been beyond catastrophic. Our local partner organizations, Aisha, Association for Women and Child Protection and Women's Affairs Center, shifted their focus to provide humanitarian aid instead. Displaced from Gaza City to the southern area of Rafah, many have lost their homes, family members, and colleagues. Even now they face dire conditions. They have tirelessly provided essential support, including distributing hygiene kits and food coupons to women and families, offering cash assistance to displaced individuals, and recently establishing a kitchen to prepare meals for displaced families living in tents. So to conclude, in the words of the Kvinna Secretary General, yes, 3 decades ago, a group of women chose not to stand by silently. And at Kvinna, we continue to make this choice to show up and speak up for women and girls. Thank you.
So we had a few questions. So the first one is a big one. How can we provide your work? How do we help women in the world?
Well, I think that the most important thing is really keeping our eyes and ears open and monitoring media and unofficial media and talking about these issues, making them significant in the social circus we belong to. We, of course, think that it's important to support organizations like us who are really working to empower and strengthen women's movements and women human rights defenders, and also provide them with safe spaces. But I think in particular, it's very important in every society to keep the dialogue and the narrative going. Talk about it with everyone, with your grandparents, boyfriends, girlfriends, friends at the university, professors. Raise it in political discussions when you prepare to vote. Think about it, like they talk about these gender lens. I call them women's rights lens. Everything that we do, if we every time think about how is this going to impact women and girls in my society, we're already making a huge change.
Okay, let's see. We had a question about the military. Have you noted any differences in militarization if there are female soldiers in the military units? Are women's voices better heard and considered if female soldiers participate in the troops?
It is not something we have done specific research on, but then women soldiers are so rarely part of the conflict-affected areas where we work that it would be very, very difficult to measure. But it is one of the purposes of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which calls for women not only being present more in peace negotiations, but also being more present in terms of gender mainstreaming the military, the defense ministries, and so on. But that is just creating mass representation. But until specific issues are dealt with, that is not enough. So it is important to have women's representation, but also to ensure that women's rights and women's participation and women's needs are on the agenda, that money is there for them in the budgets.
You actually talked a bit about Gaza, but we got a question. Does Kvinna work in Gaza? Maybe you talked about it a bit, but maybe you want to.
Yes. I mean, I work in the Western Balkans, so I do not have direct experience, but we have worked in Palestine for a long time, and especially now also. So we do work in Gaza.
I had another question about Gaza and Israel. In Israel, everyone is obliged to do the military service. Are women also involved in the attack on Gaza, or are they protected from fighting there?
I really wouldn't know. It's not research that we have access to.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Lejla, for the presentation on this important topic. This presentation will be, you can be able to watch it on Stockholm's Kvinnohistorika's website in a few days. And to the audience, thank you so much for listening. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.